Erev Tov. We saw already last week that Rebbi Chaim Shmuelevitz addressed his Talmidim at the time of the Yom Kippur War with a push for number one, Torah, number two, Tefillah, and number three, to avoid Pachad. In the second a category of Tefillah, he quotes Noach. And Chazal point out that Yeshayahu HaNavi calls the waters of the Mabul twice Mei Noach, as if to imply that to some extent Noach was responsible for the Mabul. And the question is obvious, that each tzaddik, tamim hayah, etc., how could you blame Noach? And the Gemara says, Al shelo ispalel al b'nei doro. And Reb Chaim introduced a kal v'chomer, if you recall, if Tfilas Yochid of Noach could have been so powerful, and therefore Noach was responsible for not putting forth that Tfilas Yochid, how much more so Tfilas Rabim, if we as a yeshiva will be mispalel, how effective that tefillah will be. Tonight I want to discuss a brilliant question of Rebbi Chaim Shmuelevitz, absolutely brilliant. And if you have the essay, maybe you printed it out or you have it on your phone, you'll see this on the second page of the essay, which is called Reish Yud. And in the second Maimer, which is called Maimer Bet, in the second paragraph, he refers back to what he had mentioned earlier about Noach lo ispalel al b'nei doro. And Reb Chaim asked the following brilliant question. And on the side, just my own Argosh Salev, it always amazes me that Reb Chaim Shmuelevitz took the approach of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik and applied it to Agadita. And as I'm going to try to prove as we go along. Reb Chaim asks an amazing kasha. In Parshas Vayera, we're going to learn that Avram Avinu is praying on behalf of Sodom, but at some point I'm going to use a proverbial expression, he drops the ball, raises his hands and realizes he can't go further. Chazal explained that Avram Avinu had a Rebbi who taught him, I don't mean face-to-face, but established the principle in the context of tefillah, the rules of tefillah on behalf of a nation, when there's a gzar din to destroy that nation. The rule of tefillah is that you can only put forth and present an effective tefillah if there's a minimum of 10 tzaddikim in that society. Avram realized that in the case of Sodom, he could not chalk up 10 tzaddikim, and therefore he dropped the entire enterprise of tefillah. He realized it was a tefillah shav. And he learned this from Noach. Noach in the Teva could not come up with 10 tzaddikim. On the face of the earth, there were no 10 tzaddikim. So on the side, when we live in a world of Hamas, where the Secretary General of the United Nations, and I say this with such cynicism and sarcasm, can defend Hamas, it's ha'aretz molea chamas mipneihem. This is the world that we live in, and we can begin to understand why HaKadosh Baruch Hu destroyed the Dar of the Mabul. In any event, getting back to Reb Chaim's kasha, Reb Chaim asked the following kasha. If Chazal are critiquing Noach because he wasn't mispalel, and that is implicit in the fact that the Mabul is called Mei Noach, then the implication is, or shall we say the underlying premise is, that Noach could have prayed and his prayer could have been effective. If I were to convince you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Noach could not have possibly put forth an effective prayer, and it would be just a tefillah shav that would fall, if you pardon the expression, on deaf ears above, then how could you possibly blame Noach, shelo ispalel al b'nei doro? Even if I would grant you that he was mispalel, even had he gone ahead and he was mispalel, according to the rules of tefillah, with regard to this gzera against the door, that tefillah would have been ineffective. It would have been meaningless. It could not have achieved any goal because there was no minimum count of 10 tzaddikim. So how can you possibly critique Noach, Shalos Palal B'nei Doro, when the tefillah of Noach, even had he prayed it, would not have been effective? As we see from Avram, who derived it from Noach, there was no minimum of 10. And to answer this question, Reb Chaim comes up with an absolute revolution. And he says that there are two dimensions, two categories of tefillah. One category of tefillah is governed and regulated and restricted to the rules, the ground rules of tefillah. It fits into the miskeret, the framework of tefillah, and it cannot be effective if there are less than 10 tzaddikim. But there's another category of tefillah, says Reb Chaim, which is even more powerful and more effective than classic tefillah, and it breaks the rules of tefillah. It's not bound by that restriction and that condition of 10. What is that second category of tefillah? And moreover, how does Reb Chaim know that such a second category exists? Of course, he could prove it from Noach, because Noach has taken the task for not employing tefillah, but that means the second category of tefillah, which could be effective to save Sdom, even if I grant you that there were no 10 tzaddikim. What is this second category of tefillah? And I don't know if any of you have on your mind, because I can't read your minds, an answer to that question, without even looking in Reb Chaim to see what Rav Shmuelevitz said 50 years ago during the Yom Kippur War.
Doesn't the Rav say something about slichos? It breaks the rules because it's petition at night or something?
I don't know. Honestly, I'm not familiar with that chiddush of Rav Soloveitchik. I know he often speaks about the power of slichos. He talks about the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Kores Bris with Klal Yisrael, that when they recite the 13 Midos Harachmim, which is the essence of Slichos, Lo Yoshuv Rekam, that tefillah will not go unanswered. But once again, I think that you're talking about a bris with Knesset Yisrael when HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed it to Moshe Rabbeinu in Parshas Ki Tisa, but not in the historical context of Noach and Avram Avinu. This was way before that bris. And not only that, I would say that the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim are effective on behalf of Klal Yisrael. We're not talking about Klal Yisrael here. We're talking about Klal HaOlam, what we call Enoshut, the human race. Reb Chaim comes up with a new category of tefillah. He calls it Tza'aka, Tzadi Aleph Kuf Hey. You'll see this all on page Reish Yud. I'm expanding it. What is Tza'aka? What generates Tza'aka? And why is it more effective than classic tefillah? Why is it not restricted and bound by the rules that govern tefillah? And how does Reb Chaim know that there is such a category called Tza'aka? The Rambam, by the way, I'm just adding my own, at the beginning of Hilchas Tainios, Yesh Bechlal Mitzvah Achas Lizok Al Kol Tzara Shelo Tov Al Hatzibur. There is a concept called Tza'aka. And Reb Chaim Shmuelevitz says that Tza'aka is effective where tefillah is not. Why is that so? And Reb Chaim says the following, that tefillah of Tza'aka is generated by Ke'ev. Again, I'll add my own. Baruch Hashem, my wife gave birth to 6 children, and I can tell you that on 6 occasions during labor, she let out a cry, more than one. When a person is in pain, when they're suffering, it's the most natural instinct. It's almost innate in the human condition that he yells and he screams with a tza'aka. It's not something that's intellectual. It's not something that's thought out. It's not calculated. It's a natural response, almost like a knee-jerk response. But the precondition for tza'aka is ke'ev, if you feel the ke'ev. And Reb Chaim says that this is the finger of guilt that's being pointed at Noach. Where was the ke'ev? Where was the sense of identity, of identifying with those who would suffer? You could imagine a vision. Again, I'm adding to Reb Chaim, just to be dramatic. Imagine Noach in the Teva, and the waters are rising, and a mother is holding on to a child, trying to climb a tree to reach higher and higher levels. And the child, by the virtue of the strong rain that's coming down, is being pulled away from his mother. Imagine the ke'ev that someone would feel if he empathizes. I don't use the word sympathize, empathize, to identify, to feel the pain of someone else. And you know that Chazal speak about lo tikom. Again, I apologize that I'm adding something here, but I think it's relevant. Chazal and the Sifri talk about lo tikom as if by taking the kama, one hand that hurt the other hand, the hurt hand is now going to hit the first hand. So what do you gain by that? Instead of having one hand injured, you have two hands that are injured. We're all part of Guf Echad, and the cave is one. Now, again, there are many questions that I could ask on Reb Chaim, given the fact that this generation of the Mabul was not a generation that necessarily you want to identify with and empathize with, but nevertheless, if there's a way of saving that generation, with some glimmer of hope, it could be through tza'aka that comes mitoch ha'ke'ev. And tza'aka mitoch ha'ke'ev, says Reb Chaim, is not limited and bound by the minimum number of 10. Tza'aka mitoch ha'ke'ev could destroy and uproot a gzera even in the absence of 10. And once again, I ask the question, how does Reb Chaim know such a thing?
Sorry, just on point.
Drop louder, because on Zoom you have to raise your voice.
Why is Avram Patur from Tza'aka?
No, Reb Chaim answers that question. He says that Avram Avinu was involved in Tza'aka, and then he picked up on Tefillah. When he realized that Tefillah was ineffective, at that point, the Gzera was sealed. So Avram was not guilty of the absence of Tza'aka, but Noach was not involved in that Tefillah, which we call Tza'aka. So when Chazal say Shelo Ispalel al Bnei Doro, we have to make it add a little asterisk. Lo Ispalel in this context means Lo Ispalel Tefillah Shel Tza'aka. But how does Reb Chaim know that a Tefillah Shel Tza'aka would have been effective to stave off the decree of the destruction of the generation of the Mabul? Why would that be effective where Tefillah would not be effective? Why is Tza'aka more effective than Tefillah, and how does Reb Chaim know such a thing?
How about the beginning of Shmos? V'yanchu b'nei Yisrael min ha'avodah v'yizaku v'ta'al shavasam el Hashem min ha'avodah v'yanchu min ha'avodah.
But again, if Rav Moshe, if Za'aka is a subcategory of Tefillah, it's a second category of Tefillah, then at the end of the day, you come back to Tefillah, no matter how you slice the cake. And Vatal Shavasam El Elokim is a kind of a Tefillah. But in that case, there were more than 10 tzaddikim. But in the case of Noach, there weren't any 10 tzaddikim. We wonder why Chazal understood and Yeshayahu Hanavi understood that Noach should have felt the pain of his generation. Why did Avram Avinu feel the pain and the cave of his generation of stone? We know the evil nature of stone. But nevertheless, if there's a glimmer of hope, because although Yetzer Lev ha'adam Rami to Urav, nevertheless man could overcome evil. And therefore there was a taina tviyah against Noach that he didn't let out a Za'aka, which is a separate category of tefillah. Where, again, I ask you, does Reb Chaim know and derive the conclusion that Za'aka is even greater than tefillah? It is a category of tefillah which defies and undermines the requirement of 10 tzaddikim. And here Reb Chaim again, for every move in Reb Chaim, I would give him a PhD. It's unbelievable, his creativity. He says the following, the Pasuk says at the end of Dvarim, Kikel emunah ein ovel. Tzaddik v'yosher hu. The pasuk says, Ki chol drachav emunah, kel emunah v'ein ovel. Reb Chaim asked the following question. What does it mean when it says, Hatzur tamim pa'alo? What does the word tamim mean? You know, we use the word tamim very often as a midah, as an attribute. A person's a tamim. But the real translation of the word tamim means shalem or perfect. Tzur means Hashem, tamim pa'alo. Kol jachav mishpat. Let's take, says Reb Chaim, these two words in the pasuk, one from the beginning of the pasuk, one from the end. On the one hand, the Torah says tamim to describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his pe'olo, which means that God is perfect. But on the other hand, the end of the pasuk says mishpat, kol drachav mishpat. Says Reb Chaim, the tamim at the beginning of the pasuk is going to shed a light on the mishpat at the end of the pasuk, meaning that God's mishpat is perfect. Says Reb Chaim, what makes the divine mishpat unique and perfect in comparison, in contrast to the mishpat of our world, whether it be a non-Jewish court or even a Jewish court? There is no tamim and no shlemut, no perfection in human judgment. A man is accused of a crime. Let's dramatize it. Let's say it's a capital crime. The evidence comes in front of the court, and after weighing the evidence very carefully, the court condemns the man, finding the nidon guilty, the nesham as they call him here in Israel, and therefore mete out the punishment. Imagine in a capital crime, you put a person, a criminal, to death for violating a capital crime. What about his wife? She becomes a widow. What about his children? Become orphans. What about his friends? What about his society? You know, you throw a stone into a river and it has a ripple effect. You mete out punishment to an individual who's guilty and for sure deserves that punishment. But what impact is going to have on others? And therefore, human judgment and human punishment is by definition imperfect. It's impossible for Basar V'Dam and even for the Bezdin Shalmala without HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Tzur Tamim Palo to have a mishpat that's Tamim. Because there are those who will suffer as a result of the punishment that's meted out to the criminal. And so our judgment is limited, is finite, because all we can do is the punishment for the crime of that individual. But Atzur Tamim Palo, in contrast, the divine judgment is perfect. Says Reb Chaim, the divine being, when he, with a capital H, metes out punishment, he takes into consideration all the ripple effects, all the repercussions, all those who will suffer as a result of the implementation of that punishment. And therefore, says Reb Chaim, Sa'aka plays a role and is effective, superseding that of tefillah. What is tza'aka? Tza'aka is a response to ke'ev. If a person has a beloved relative, friend, neighbor who is suffering, who is being threatened by Gzeira, and he's, let's say, outside of the Gzeira, he's not a soldier on the front lines, he's on the back lines, like the Yeshiva Bachram in the Mir. The question is, does he feel the ke'ev? And if the answer is he feels the ke'ev, then he has a tza'aka. And he is saying to the Ribono Shalom, Atzur Tamim Palo, how could you possibly mete out this Gzeira? What impact will it have on me? Chazal say that Moshe Rabbeinu had a taina against the Bnei Dar because they weren't mispalel. When the Gzeira was signed by a Kadosh Baruch Hu that Moshe Rabbeinu would not enter into the land. Excuse me. But wait a second. Moshe Rabbeinu was mispalel to be Mavatal Gzeira. Who remembers how many, the magic number of tefillos that Moshe Rabbeinu prayed? Don't all answer at once. I can't hear too many voices. 515 tefillos, Keminyan V'eschanon, the Gematria V'eschanon. Moshe Rabbeinu prayed 515 tefillos to enter into the land, and he has a taina and a tefillah against Klal Yisrael because they didn't pray on their behalf, meaning had they prayed on his behalf, the tefillah of Bnei Yisrael would have had an impact in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have ripped up this Gzeira and allowed Moshe Rabbeinu to enter into the land. Says Rebbi Chaim, the tefillos of Moshe Rabbeinu were tefillos b'dinei tefillah, and they are limited and confined by the conditions that apply to regular classic tefillah. But what was Moshe Rabbeinu hoping for with regard to Klal Yisrael? Not tefillah in the classic sense, in the limited sense, but rather tza'aka. Where was the ke'ev? Where was the fact that they were going to lose Moshe Rabbeinu, the teacher of Torah, the one who brought about all the miracles and saved them, the one who says, Mecheni no misifcha? Where was that ke'ev? Where was that tza'aka? That's the tefillah, the taina of Moshe Rabbeinu. Your tza'aka would have worked and been effective in operating where my tefillah was ineffective because it's a tefillah shel tza'aka. Mitoch ha'ke'ev. And Reb Chaim has a fascinating proof from Chazal that sometimes we are held to task for passivity, even when the opposite of passivity would have been ineffective. Because Chazal tell us that when Paro was weighing the possibility of destroying the Jewish people, Havan Ischak Malo, he called in his advisory board, his war cabinet. How many members were there in the war cabinet? By a show of fingers. 3. Who were they? Bilam, Yisro, and Eo. Bilam said, rah, rah, rah. Kill the occupants of Palestine. Just wipe them out. They're all have occupied our land. Right? You can see, Rabbo, say how much I was shooken up by this Yemach Shemo. I'm telling you, he should be killed publicly. He is the general of the United Nations, Yemach Shemo. Of course, Rashi in Parshas Bereishis was already aware of this, that the lister, they'll call us lister. Turn back the clock to 1947. I wanted to tell him, hey, do you remember that the United Nations itself voted in the state of Israel 75 years ago? Anyway. What was the response of Yisro and of Eo? Bilam, rah, 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 kill the Jews. And therefore Bilam would suffer death at the sword. And that's what happened. He was killed b'cheret. Yisro barach. Yisro ran away. And he was zocher that his descendants would serve in the Beis HaMikdash. And what did Eov do? Shasak. Eov was silent. V'nidon l'chai yisurim. whenever we talk about a life of suffering, the paradigm is Eov. I'm going to present to you now Rebbi Chaim Shmuelevitz's kasha on this Maimer Chazal, and once again, be ready to give him a PhD. Frekt Rebbi Chaim, if Eov is guilty of Shasika, we know that the opposite of Shasika is what? If you ever learned Perek Cheskes Habatim in Sanhedrin, I'm sorry, in Baba Basra, I meant to say, you'll know what I mean. What's the opposite of Shtika? Mecha, Mem Ches Aleph Hey, right? You're sitting in my land. If I'm silent, I didn't make a mecha. So if we're going to hold Eov to task for Shtika, then basically we're saying that he should have made a mecha. Says Reb Chaim, I don't understand. If Eov had made a mecha, it would not have changed the gzera ki huzeh. It was not effective. How does Reb Chaim know that a mecha would not be effective? From Yisro. Why did Yisro get up and run away? Why didn't Yisro get up at the meeting, bang on the table and say, I'm opposed? I veto. Again, we're back to the United Nations. You know, those countries that abstain when Israel is being attacked in the United Nations, right? Those are the Eov members of the United Nations. But then you have those who run away. What does that mean, run away? If Yisro is being blessed with a great reward because he ran away, I would have said, says Reb Chaim, let him be punished for not making a mecha. What do you mean he ran away? Says Reb Chaim. I could just hear his voice. You know, I heard many of his shmuzim. Of course, it was very difficult to understand him. Reb Chaim would say, we can design, how could it be? Eov Barach? He should have made a mecha, but the answer is the mecha wouldn't have helped. The mecha would have been ineffective. So why then is Eov held to task for shtika if mecha wouldn't have been effective? Says Reb Chaim, had Eov identified with the Jewish people and their suffering, had Eov felt the ka'ev, then he wouldn't have been shosek. And even if his mecha would not be effective, nevertheless, he should have let out a cry. His shtika indicates that he did not feel the ka'ev. And if you don't feel the ka'ev, Eov, you're going to live a life of ka'ev, midah keneged midah. Says Reb Chaim, we see very clearly that sometimes a person is held to task even when, according to the rules that apply, it wouldn't have been effective anyway. But nevertheless, where's the tza'aka of ka'ev? And the absence of tza'aka of ka'ev is indicative of the fact that you really don't identify. I don't know where to press this button here, but okay. Anybody want to help me with the technicalities of Zoom? What do I? All right.
He muted. Yeah.
Oh,
I think he muted.
He's muted.
All right, don't tell me who it was. So Rabbosai, 50 years ago, Rebbi Chaim Shmuelevitz asks his Talmidim, where is your za'aka? Rebbi Chaim is less concerned about tefillah, more concerned about za'aka. Why aren't you feeling the pain? You're not at the front lines. And this, my friends, is what we have to ask ourselves today. And I would add, that the ka'ev is not just for the just those who were murdered, not just for those who are hostages we can't even fathom, not only for the Chayalim. I know you've seen, various clips, where they're dancing and singing, they're bringing food for them, but that's not going to last very long, unfortunately. Where is the Sa'aka mitoch ha'ke'ev? And by the way, it's not a function of how high the volume of your voice is. It's a function of how much you feel the pain. And in the next shmooze, which is number Gimel, Reb Chaim is going to ask, why is it that we don't feel the pain? And he has a whole beautiful mimer, a shmooze about that, which we'll get to in Mirz Hashem. Reb Chaim writes on the bottom of the second page, which is Reish Yud. And by the way, I did some research. This is Reb Chaim's own pen. In other words, he gave the shmuzim, and then he edited these written words. Nimtza de shnei dinim hein b'chiyuv tefillah. Who does that sound like? Shnei dinim. The other Reb Chaim. Reishis kipshuto shechayim midinei tefillah. V'al zeh amru kol sheyesh lo efshos lispalel v'lo ispal nikra chote. But again, only if his tefillah could be affected. V'abeis, but there's another chiyuv and another din of tefillah. Shu mechuyev litztair al chavero. And that applies even in a case where his tefillah would not be affected. Because if he feels that tsar, as it expresses itself in Za'aka, could save his friend. Now, Reb Chaim, 1 second, unfortunately, this should be fine. Oh, Baruch Hashem. Reb Chaim on the top of page Reish Aleph, for those who might want to follow inside, wraps this all up, and he speaks about Tsar, Ke'ev, and Sa'ak, and how effective it is even when tefillah is not effective, because Hatzur Tamim Pol. Then in the second paragraph on page Reish Aleph, towards the end of this Shmuz Maimer Beis, Reb Chaim comes back to something that he started with at the very beginning of Maimer Beis. And that is, Esther's fast for 3 days and 3 nights. Reb Chaim says something which is very, very challenging for me personally to understand. Maybe you'll help me with it. I'm really schwitzing it out. Reb Chaim writes that according to Chazal, the 3 days Yom V'Layla of Esther's Tainus coincided with Chag HaPesach in Chodesh Nisan, and it trumped the mitzvah of matzah. They did not eat matzah because they were fasting. And Reb Chaim says that we have no choice. You see, Reb Chaim puts on his Lumdisha thinking cap, and in the halachic framework, you can't accept a tainus that would undermine a mitzvah doraisa of matzah. We don't have that many mitzvahs doraisas in terms of achila. We have matzah. We have, of course, daled minim and sukkah, but you can count them all on one hand. So to give up the mitzvah of matzah, how could we do such a thing? How does the halacha condone fasting and trumping the mitzvah of matzah? Now, I'm going to suggest that Reb Chaim understands that Klal Yisrael at the time of Esther with the Gzeres Haman were in a state of sakana, no question about it. And when there's a sakana, we have halacha pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh is docha kol haTorah kula, including matzah. Why is Reb Chaim bothered by this? He doesn't spell out the question. I believe, and I discussed this with my son Binyamin, that there's something called a davar skuli. Let me give you an example. During COVID, I used to give a weekly shir on the contemporary issues in COVID. And the Lakewood Yeshiva, the shul in Lakewood the rabbi in Lakewood produced a sefer full of tshuvas. And one particular tshuva caught my fancy. There was a Jew in a hospital in the United States who was literally dying of COVID. His life was in the balance. He asked on a Saturday night, when he got the word how severe his situation was, to call his Rebbe in Eretz Yisrael, where it was Shabbos. And he was begging for a bracha from his Rebbe. And without going into all the details, the question arose as to whether we could violate the Shabbos for what's called refuah skulit. There's no medical basis, no scientific justification for the assumption that a bracha from a Rebbe could bring about someone's refuah. Although I don't know if you heard about the Rav Grossman story. I don't know if you heard that. If not, let me know. I'll send you the video. So therefore, they paskin that they cannot violate the Shabbos for the sake of a bracha. Again, there are a host of issues here, which I'm not getting into. It has to do with the whole sugya Shabbos about what's it called? Kamiyas. You know what I'm talking about? Kamiyah. No scientific basis for the efficacy of kamiyas. And the maskana of that sugya was that even if you'd be absolutely convinced that based on a metaphysical skula power, you could save the people, you would still not be permitted to override the Shabbos. And the Rambam goes into great detail to say that you could be machal Shabbos in pikuach nefesh only with refuah. And refuah, says the Rambam, has to be scientific, has to be medical. If that be the case, perhaps I understand what bothers the mind of Rebbi Chaim Shmuelevitz. How could Esther declare a fast and undermine a mitzvah d'oraisa of matzah based on the need to fast? Fasting will not bring about the, what's the word I'm looking for? Invalidation, the cancellation. Okay, I'm looking for a word here. The cancellation
or repeal
of the decree of home.
annulment.
So therefore, fasting will come under what category? Refuah skulit. How could refuah skulit override the mitzvah of matzah? This, I believe, is Reb Chaim's kash. But what's his answer, if that's his kash? And if you take a look on page Reish Yud, the beginning of this Maimer Beis, he writes, Al Karchach, we have no choice, Shezu Eitzah, this Eitzah of fasting, where Esther says to Mordechai, Lech knos kol yud v'tzum olai, etc., shloshi yomim, laila v'yom, he Eitzah b'derech hateva. What's the opposite of skula? Teva. Makes no sense. Who can tell me that fasting could bring about the repeal of the Gzeira of Haman al Pi Derech HaTeva? What is Reb Chaim talking about here? I believe that the word Teva in the terminology, in the lexicon of Rebbi Chaim Shmuelevitz means something different than what it means in our terminology. And the word Teva means a rule that's like Teva. It's like the law of physics, in that it's built into the way God created the universe. It may be metaphysical, but it's in the rules inherent in the divine creation. That's called Teva. There's no rule in divine creation that the Gzeira of Haman would be repealed by a davar skuli. Because a skula is something that goes beyond the way that God rules and runs the world. And therefore, Reb Chaim says that the tzumo alai must be predicated on some sort of law within the divine creation. And therefore, it's called Derech HaTeva. What rule in divine creation would make it such that fasting for 3 days would necessitate the repealing of the Gzeira of Haman? Why is that called Teva? Even if I grant you that Teva in Reb Chaim's frame of reference has a different definition, a much broader definition. Why isn't it Skula? Why is it Teva? And the answer, I believe, is that the mitzvah of tainus is identical with the mitzvah of za'aka. And God built the universe in which Hatzur Tamim Palo V'chol Drachav Mishpat. And what does it mean, Hatzur Tamim Palo? If there's Ke'ev, if there's Tza'aka, then there'll be bittul like Zera. That's called in Reb Chaim's language Derech HaTeva. It is muchach, so to speak. It must be that if the Ke'ev will reach a summit, if the Ke'ev will be very, very powerful. Saying a prayer for the pilot. Then Tza'aka and Ke'ev of the entire Jewish nation of 3 days of fasting and crying out to Hashem, that will guarantee that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be mevatel l'gzeira. And that's called Derech Teva. And if that's Derech Teva, then it overrides the mitzvah of matzah, because it's no longer categorized as a refuah skulit. And now Reb Chaim says that there's another rule of Teva that seems metaphysical, but is muchach al pi Teva, based on the divine Teva and the way God is the perfect judge. And that is called Shviras Hamidos. Reb Chaim says that Esther was employing a two-pronged attack to destroy and uproot the Gzeira of Haman. Number one, Za'aka, which is tainus, and number two, Shviras Hamidos. Chazal say that before Esther went into Achashverosh, for the last Seudah, and can you imagine what she looked like, how she appeared after 3 days of fasting? She would not be Motzi Chen B'Einov. Chazal say, Lovsha Ruach HaKodesh. What was that Ruach HaKodesh? The Ruach HaKodesh gave her wisdom and insight to understand the Teva of HaKodesh Baruch Hu and how to undermine the Gzeirah. So what does Esther do? She invites Haman to the Suda. And Chazal say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu responded to that action. Why? Why was it so significant and impactful in the divine judgment that she invited Haman? And Chazal say, Hishpilas Atzma. She wasn't interested in her covet. Imagine going to your arch enemy, the biggest anti-Semite that probably ever walked this earth. Although now I'm questioning it. Maybe they've gone beyond Haman. I don't know. And she lowers herself to invite him to a party. Says Reb Chaim, that's Shviras Hamidos. And she has the right to say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if I, Esther, am Shoveres Midas, I give up on kavod, a mashpil, then you too, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, have to be shover your midas adin. And here is where Reb Chaim says, this is very, very famous, I'm sure you all know about it. Reb Chaim says they were in the bunkers on Yom Kippur. And the bombs were flying. They're not bunkers, that's a bad word. Oh, we'll call it a miklat, right? And the threat was that the bombs that were falling here and there would break through the miklat and they would all perish.
I think he said it during the 6-Day War. I think it was during the 6-Day War, he said.
Not during Yom Kippur.
Just,
okay, great. Thank you, David.
Because there were no bombs in Yerushalayim on Yom Kippur War, I think. As far as I know.
But he definitely is talking about the tefillos of Yom Kippur. So I'll have to work this out. I don't want to do it now. He says that the
it says in the thing. It says Milchemet Sheshet Yamim. It says in the next paragraph.
I don't understand how to reconcile that with the next line where he says that,
no, but the next paragraph says Sheshet Yamim.
No. I'm just saying.
Yeah, he's giving you as an example of what happened in the 6-Day War, but that's all.
Okay, you're forcing me to look inside. I didn't want.
So in the middle of Reish Yud Aleph.
Yeah, no, I have it. I have it in front. I'm reading it.
Because
so it means that even though Reb Chaim, when he did the editing of his shmuzim, so he integrated a shmuz that he gave during Milchemet Sheshet Yamim into his shmuz that he gave many years earlier. No, I'm sorry. Let me get this.
It wasn't a schmooze. He was
19
telling a story.
Wait, just give me 1 second. I'm sorry. I got mixed up with the mathematics here. I'm sorry. So again, he's talking about Yom Kippur. Oh, yeah. Okay, great.
Right. He's talking in 1973 about what happened in 1966.
Right. Milchemes Yom Kippurim is 6 years later, correct?
Right.
So he's now talking his Talmidim in a shmuz on Motzei Yom Kippur. I don't mean literally Motzei Yom Kippur. And he's explaining to them how we can possibly break the gzera of Milchemet Sheshet Yamim. And by the way, I think you know this, before Milchemet Sheshet Yamim actually broke out, they were digging graves here because they didn't think they had enough graves to bury the dead after the war that was threatened by all our enemies would take place. In any event, getting back to Reb Chaim. So Reb Chaim says that during the 6-Day War, they were in the miklat. Does he use that word miklat? Let me just see. Oh, yes, miklat. And the bombs were threatening, again, don't ask me the physics of it, but it seems that the bombs were threatening to destroy the miklat. Just don't know why he's talking about Hashem Elokim. Give me 1 more second. I'm sorry. I'm still stuck with the mathematics here. 1 second. Okay, I guess during the
He's talking about Shirat Hamidot. He's talking about Shirat Hamidot.
No.
He's giving an example.
I'm bothered by the Shem Hu Elokim and the Shema Yisrael. He tells you that they repeated. That's why I thought he was talking about Yom Kippur. He's talking about Milchemes Sheish Yamim.
He's talking about Shirat Hamidot, about the Agunah that was with him.
I apologize. Just give me 1 minute. Just sometimes I get stuck with a mathematical problem. I just want to clear it for myself. I'm sorry. Just give me 1 second. I'll be right with you. So again, he's talking to the Talmidim on Yom Kippurim. Just 1 second. And he's telling them what happened during Milchemet Sheish Yamim. Hapkazim naflu al binyan. Just 1 second. Which was some news. Yoter mitfilatam. So again, I'm going to suggest the following. You'll check me out in the text and you'll tell me whether I'm right or wrong. I think during Milchemet Sheish Yamim, the tefillos were the tefillos of Yom Kippur. Again, it wasn't Yom Kippur. We're talking in the month of June, right? But they were mispalel the way they were mispalel on Yom Kippur, with Shema Yisrael multiple times, Hashem Elokeichem Emes multiple times. In any event, you'll check that out, whether that's correct or not. I think that's correct. Says Rebbi Chaim, and he's talking during the Yom Kippur War. He says to his Talmidim, what saved us when the bombs were flying and threatening to kill us in the Miklat in Milchemet Sheish Yamim? What saved us is Shviras Hamidos. When a woman who's an Aguna, whose husband had left her 20 years ago, never gave her a get, he flew the coop, she gets up in the Miklat and she says, I hereby am mochel my husband for all the humiliation and pain that he caused me over the course of 2 decades. And she pleads with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just like I was shover my midos. Who could be able to be mochel after all that suffering, enduring so much pain and humiliation, and she was able to break that midah? You too, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, respond in tune to break the midah of din and have rachamim. Now, this is a Baal Musar. It's not just coincidental that, the book of Rebbi Chaim Shmuelevitz called Sichot Musar. He is steeped in the Musar movement. His father-in-law was one of the shining lights of the Musar movement. If you ever heard of Nevardik, which is one of the movements amongst the Talmidim of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. In Musar, perhaps the highest level you could reach in Musar is Shviras Hamidos. In Nevardik, again, I'm not advocating this, but in Nevardik, they would purposely set themselves up in self-humiliation as part of Shviras Hamidos. You remember the story about the Nevardikas? He gets online to wait for a ticket to the train. And he's waiting and waiting and waiting. He gets to the front of the line. The cashier says, okay, that'll cost you 10 rubles. Digs into his pocket. He doesn't have a single ruble. He humiliated himself. The Nevardikas were able to change the very nature of man. And that's called Shviras Hamidos. That's the highest level of Musar. And it could invoke a corresponding Shviras Hamidos on the part of the divine being, of the part of the Eibishter. And Reb Chaim is saying to the Talmidim, and we could say it to ourselves today, in terms of how to get this change in the Gzeira, with a method of Teva meaning within the system as God created it, we should work on Shviras Hamidos. So take, for example, a Rebbe in a yeshiva. He teaches X number of Talmidim, And then they bring in another Rebbe, and they split the class into two. He ends up with X over 2, half the Talmidim. But everybody has to figure out in their own life what Shviras Hamidos would mean when a person is willing to look the other way, to be mochel others, and to accept a kind of shiflus that defies and undermines his kavod atzmi. And we're all basically Baalei Gaiva. And to wrap things up for tonight, and I'll give just after I finish the next paragraph, I'll give you a little 2-minute introduction to where we want to go from here, again, if you're interested. Rebbi Chaim says, why is it that we're not crying out? We can take advantage of the methodology of Tza'aka B'toch HaKev, Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo, that could be effective where tefillah is not effective. Why is it that we're not feeling that Ke'ev? And that's Maimer Gimel. And the thesis that underlies Maimer Gimel is that the further away that we are from the danger, the less we feel the danger and the Ke'ev. He goes as far as to say, you remember last week we spoke about the fact that they split the Shevet, Elef Lamateh, and for every member of the Pluga that went out to war, there was another member of the Shevet that was B'tfilah. Chazal say that even those who were mispalel were sent out to the front line in order to feel the Ke'ev and to implement Tza'aka. Why is it that when Yishmael is dying, Hagar runs away from the scene, so to speak? Kiblo Tavas. Because the closer you are, the more you feel it. If we are distanced, then we don't feel the pain. And not only that, says Rebbi Chaim, with the passage of time, we don't feel the pain. And here Rebbi Chaim gives a brilliant insight into the whole story of the killing of Esav on the part of what's his name?
Chushim.
What's his first name? Ben Dan?
Chushim Ben Dan. Chushim
Ben Dan. Very famous Sichas Musar Rebbi Chaim. What was the difference between Chushim Ben Dan? He didn't hear all the Masumatin that the brothers were trying to fight against, those members of Esav and his collaborators who refused to bury Yaakov in Moras HaMachpelah. He didn't hear about this. They were involved in an ongoing debate, but Chushim was deaf. And as soon as he became aware of the fact that Esav was objecting to burying Yaakov in the Moras HaMachpelah, immediately he took off Esav's head, which rolled into the Morah, and so forth and so forth, because Chushim Ben Dan had an immediate response. And you may hear, which again, I'm not saying I agree with this philosophy, that we're losing time by delaying the ground invasion because the Chayalim are losing that push as time passes. All of the human emotions tend to wane away with the passage of time. And when we are distanced, then because of that distance, we don't feel the Ke'ev. And if we don't feel the Ke'ev, that deep sense of pain and suffering, that we don't have the Tza'aka, and it's the Tza'aka that could possibly save us from the Gzir. So I'm going to end now with the tefillah, and then I just want to tell you, I found a very interesting essay that you might be willing to learn with me together next week. Up to you. My tefillah is that we should be zocher to feel the ke'ev, and I'll tell you the truth, I don't think it's hard for us to feel that ke'ev, because with modern technology, it's all over the place. You have LL flights now where they have the pictures. Never. and you have all the videos and the whatnot. But I say even more than that. We feel the ka'ev because our lives are on the line. It bothered me tremendously when one of my rabbinic acquaintances from Baltimore, Maryland, he put out an essay after this terrible catastrophe, this atrocity. He put out an essay called Nakama al pi hashkafa b'Yisrael. Forget about Nakama. I wanted to yell at him. This is not about Nakama. This is about saving ourselves. It shouldn't be too difficult to feel the cave for our own sense, our own selves, unless you're willing to get on the next plane to Chutzlar. I found an essay written by Rav Adler, and with the help of David, I was able to put it up on our WhatsApp group. Have you seen it? I don't expect that you've seen it. It's very recent. And the title of the essay by Rabbi Menachem Adler of Yerushalayim is Hanerag Bidei Goy Ha'im Nikra Kadosh. There's a category, an appellation called a Kadosh. And this essay, with a tremendous amount of comprehensive research before this war broke out, before Shabbos Shmini Atzeres. What is the status of a Jew who is killed, murdered because he's a Jew? Is he called a Kadosh? Second question. A Jew who goes out to battle to save other Jews, and he himself is killed, is he called a Kadosh? And in this essay, he analyzes the concept called Haruge Malchus, which is something we mentioned in Yizkar, and Chazal say about Haruge Malchus that Ein lecha birya v'birya sha'omed b'mechitzasa. Who is Haruge Malchus? There's a Rashi in Masechta Bava Basra, there's another Rashi in Masechta Tainis, there's a Yerushalmi. He tries to organize all of this. Let me know. Please make a note of it to let me know. It's a long piece. I'm not going to expect you to read through the whole piece. I'll pick out what I think are the main points, the highlights of the essay, and we'll learn it together. The only problem is there's no page numbers here. So that makes it a little bit more difficult for me. So I know David's a magician. He's going to be able to get me page numbers. He'll probably copy the PDF file into a Word document and then add numbers, page numbers. I don't know. He'll figure it out.
I'll have my daughter do it.
Okay. All right. With that, I leave you.
Oh, that'll be an alternative to that'll be like we'll take a break from the shmuzin.
I think we've got most of the main points of the shmuzin.
Okay.
I'll look it over one more time, and I'll probably come back to you next week if I know my personality, and I'll say to you, well, we missed a few points. That's the way I operate. But the main thrust of what I want to do now would be to define a kadosh, and how does that category, and what are the repercussions of that category, how does it apply to those who were killed, murdered just because they're Jews, and even beyond that, to those who died trying to save other Jews. And it has repercussions about the Shoah and about people who are killed in a pigua, and of course, those, what shall I say, 1,400 Jews who were killed in the pogrom of the Nazis on Shabbos Shmini Atzeres. So if it interests you, it does interest me. I'm at the very beginning of the essay, but I could see that the man knows his stuff. He put work into this. He's collecting and anthologizing a massive amount of work of research in Chazal. And he has a letter from Rav Shach and a psak from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, which is mind-boggling. You know, the Talmidim, I'll just tell you quickly, he asked Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, this is not in the connection of war or anything. They asked him, is it worthwhile for us to take time out of learning to visit Kivrei Tzadikim, to go up to, what's it called, Tzfat or Meron, and daven at the Kivrei Tzadikim? And guess what Reb Shlomo Zalman answered him? You want to daven at Kivrei Tzadikim? You don't have to go up to Tzfat. You don't have to go up to Meron. You go to Har Herzl. That's Kivrei Tzadikim. Okay, Rabbosai. Thank you very much, and especially David for organizing this, and I hope you got something.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Shabbat.
Shabbat.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.